Every April, tens of millions of Americans sit down with a stack of forms, a shoebox of receipts, and a low hum of dread in their stomach. They calculate what they owe. They send a slice of their paycheck to Washington. And they do it because that is simply how the country works. The income tax feels like gravity. It feels like something woven into the fabric of the republic from the very first day, as old as the flag, as permanent as the Constitution itself. But here is something that almost nobody stops to consider. For the first 137 years of American history, that entire ritual did not exist. There was no federal income tax, no withholding from your wages, no April deadline, no forms to file. A farmer in 1850, a blacksmith in 1820, a merchant in 1880. None of them ever paid a single cent of income tax to the government in Washington. Not because they were cheating and not because the government was too weak to collect. It simply was not a thing. It did not exist. And that raises a question that sounds almost impossible when you first hear it. If there was no income tax for well over a century, then how on earth did the United States pay for anything? How did it build a navy, fight wars, run a postal service, buy the Louisiana Territory, survive a civil war, and grow from a bankrupt collection of former colonies into an industrial giant, all without reaching into the paycheck of the ordinary citizen? The answer is far stranger, far more contested, and far more revealing than most people ever learn. It's a story about hidden taxes buried inside the price of everyday goods. It's a story about an armed uprising over a tax on whiskey. It's a story about ships, ports, and customs houses, about selling off an entire continent piece by piece. And it's a story about a bitter, decades-long fight over who should actually carry the cost of running a country, a fight that split the nation along lines of region and class, and that in some ways has never truly ended. So let's go back and figure out how the machine actually worked, and why the whole thing finally came crashing down in 1913. To understand any of this, you have to start with a feeling. A deep, almost instinctive fear that the founding generation carried in their bones. And that fear was of taxes imposed from far away by a government you couldn't hold accountable. Remember what set the American Revolution in motion in the first place. It wasn't one grand philosophical dispute. It was taxes. Stamp taxes on paper and legal documents, duties on tea, charges on sugar and glass and printed matter. The British Crown, drowning in debt after years of expensive wars, looked across the Atlantic and saw the colonies as a source of revenue to be squeezed. And the colonists erupted with a phrase that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. They weren't necessarily opposed to paying for government. What enraged them was being taxed by a distant power in which they had no voice. So when those same revolutionaries won their independence and sat down to build a government of their own, they carried that trauma with them into every room. They were terrified of creating a new tyranny to replace the old one. They were suspicious of a strong central authority reaching directly into the pockets of citizens. The very idea of federal agents knocking on a farmer's door to tax what he earned or what he owned felt like exactly the kind of oppression they had just bled to escape. And you can see that fear written directly into the design of the early government. Under the first system, the Articles of Confederation, the national government had almost no power to tax at all. It could ask the states for money politely and then simply hope they sent it. Usually they didn't. The result was a government so broke it could barely function, unable to pay the soldiers who had won the war or the debts it had run up fighting it. It was a disaster, and it taught the founders a painful lesson. A government that cannot raise its own money is not really a government at all. So when they gathered to write the Constitution, they had to solve an impossible puzzle. They needed to give the new federal government real power to collect revenue, or it would collapse like the last one. But they could not give it the kind of power that would feel like the return of King George. They needed money without tyranny. They needed a tax that ordinary people would barely notice. And the man who cracked that puzzle was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, was arguably the most brilliant financial mind of his generation. and he understood something crucial about human psychology. People hate a tax they can see. A tax collector standing at your door with his hand out breeds resentment and rebellion. But a tax that's quietly folded into the price of goods, invisible, absorbed into the cost of things you buy, that kind of tax barely registers. You pay it without even realizing you're paying, and so the backbone of American government finance was born. The tariff. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When a ship arrived from Britain or France or the West Indies loaded with cloth, sugar, tea, iron, wine, or manufactured goods, it had to stop at a port and pay a duty before those goods could be unloaded and sold. The importer paid the government at the dock, then passed that cost along to shopkeepers, who passed it along to customers in the form of slightly higher prices. The consumer paid the tax without ever seeing a bill. It was, in a sense, the perfect tax for a nation that feared taxation. One of the very first major laws that the brand new Congress passed under the Constitution was the Tariff of 1789. Before the ink on the government was even dry, before the country had really figured out how to govern itself, it had already set up a system to collect duties on incoming ships. That's how central this idea was. The tariff wasn't an afterthought, it was the financial foundation of the entire enterprise. And the numbers here are genuinely staggering. For roughly the first 70 years of the Republic, from 1790 all the way to 1860, tariffs on imported goods generated somewhere around 90% of all federal revenue. 90%. Think about what that means. The Army, the Navy, the courts, the diplomats, the debt payments, the salaries of everyone working for the federal government. Nearly the entire operation was funded by taxing goods as they crossed the border on ships. The federal government essentially lived off of trade. Now, Hamilton wasn't naive. He knew that tariffs alone might not be enough, especially early on when debts from the Revolution were crushing. So he pushed for a second source of income, and this is where the story takes its first violent turn. He proposed an excise tax, an internal tax on a domestically produced good, and the good he chose was whiskey. On paper, it seemed reasonable. Whiskey was widely produced and widely consumed. Taxing it would bring in extra money to pay down the war debt. But Hamilton badly underestimated what that tax would mean to the people it landed on. Out on the western frontier, the rugged backcountry of Pennsylvania and the Appalachian territories, whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. Farmers out there grew grain, but grain was heavy and bulky and nearly impossible to haul over the mountains to eastern markets without it spoiling or costing a fortune to transport. So they did the sensible thing. They distilled their grain into whiskey. Whiskey was compact, it didn't spoil, it was easy to carry, and it was valuable. In many frontier communities, whiskey literally functioned as money. People paid debts with it, they traded it for goods. It was the currency of the West. So when the federal government announced a tax on distilled spirits in 1791, the first internal tax on a domestic product in the nation's history, those frontier farmers heard something very specific. They heard a distant government run by wealthy Easterners reaching across the mountains to tax the one thing that made their hard lives economically viable. To them, it felt exactly like what the British had done. It felt like taxation by strangers who didn't understand and didn't care. And they refused to pay. At first, it was quiet defiance. Tax collectors who showed up in the western counties found no one willing to cooperate. Then it got ugly. Revenue officers were harassed, threatened, and in some cases, tarred and feathered. A brutal, humiliating punishment. By 1794, the resistance had boiled over into open insurrection. A crowd of hundreds of armed men attacked and burned the home of a regional tax inspector. There was talk of marching on Pittsburgh, of seizing the federal garrison there. What had started as grumbling over a whiskey tax had escalated into the gravest domestic uprising the young country had yet faced. President George Washington understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't really about whiskey anymore. It was about whether the federal government had any real authority at all. If a group of armed farmers could simply refuse to obey a law they didn't like, then the entire experiment in self-government was in danger. So Washington did something extraordinary. He personally led a militia force of nearly 13,000 men, an army larger than most he had commanded during the actual revolution, westward to crush the rebellion. And when that overwhelming force marched into western Pennsylvania, The resistance simply evaporated. The rebels melted back into their farms. There was no great battle, but the message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. The government would collect its taxes, and it would use force to do it if necessary. The Whiskey Rebellion established federal authority in a way nothing else could have. And yet, and this is the fascinating part, it also confirmed just how much Americans loathed direct internal taxes. The whiskey excise was so hated, so difficult and expensive to collect that within a few years, once Thomas Jefferson came to power, it was quietly repealed. The lesson stuck. Internal taxes caused rebellions. Tariffs collected quietly at the docks did not. And so the country leaned harder than ever on the tariff. But tariffs and the occasional excise weren't the only way the government kept the lights on. There was a second great pillar, and it was sitting right under everyone's feet: land. The United States, especially in its first century, controlled an almost unimaginable amount of territory. As the nation expanded westward through the Louisiana Purchase, through treaties, through conquest and settlement, the federal government found itself the owner of hundreds of millions of acres of land. And that land was an asset it could sell. The government would survey vast tracts of the frontier, divide them into parcels, and sell them off to settlers, speculators, and companies. The money flowed straight into the treasury. For decades, public land sales were the second largest source of federal income after the tariff. In some boom years, when land speculation went wild and everyone wanted a piece of the expanding frontier, land sales brought in enormous sums. The government was, in a very literal sense, funding itself by selling the continent, acre by acre. It's a haunting detail when you sit with it, that the everyday operations of the American state were financed in part by the transfer of indigenous land into private hands. The money that built the early republic came, to a significant degree, from selling territory that had been taken. So now you can start to see the shape of the whole machine. It rested on two main legs. First, tariffs, taxes on imported goods, collected at ports, invisible to the average consumer, providing the overwhelming majority of revenue. Second, land sales, turning the vast public domain into cash. And around the edges, occasional excise taxes when money got tight, especially during wars, but always temporary, always resented, always repealed as soon as the crisis passed. And here's what made this system work for as long as it did. The federal government of the 19th century was tiny, almost incomprehensibly small compared to what we have today. There was no vast web of federal agencies, no Social Security, no Medicare, no sprawling regulatory bureaucracy, no standing military of millions. The federal government's job for most of the 1800s was narrow: run the post office, maintain a modest army and navy, handle foreign relations, service the debt, and mostly stay out of daily life. A small government has small expenses, and small expenses could be covered by tariffs and land sales without ever touching the income of ordinary citizens. It sounds almost elegant. A government that funded itself by taxing trade and selling land, leaving the individual's earnings entirely untouched. But this system had a dark side, and it produced some of the deepest and most explosive conflicts in all of American history. Because tariffs, it turns out, were never as neutral or as fair as they seemed. Here's the problem. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, which means it protects domestic manufacturers from foreign competition. If foreign cloth is taxed heavily at the border, then domestic cloth makers can charge higher prices and still compete. This was wonderful news if you owned a factory in the industrial North. It was a disaster if you were in the agricultural South. The Southern economy was built on exporting raw materials, above all cotton, to Europe, and importing manufactured goods in return. High tariffs meant Southerners paid inflated prices for nearly everything they needed to buy, while getting no benefit in return since they had almost no factories of their own to protect. Worse, they feared that European nations, angered by American tariffs, would retaliate against Southern cotton. So the South came to see the tariff not as a clever, invisible revenue tool, but as a weapon, a mechanism by which the industrial North enriched itself at the expense of the agricultural South. This tension exploded most dramatically in 1828, with a tariff so steep and so infuriating to the South that it earned a nickname, the Tariff of Abominations. Southern politicians raged that it was economic robbery. In South Carolina, the fury reached a point where the state declared it had the right to simply nullify the federal tariff within its borders and refuse to enforce it, and threatened to leave the Union entirely if forced to comply. For a terrifying moment decades before the Civil War, the country stared into the abyss of secession over a tax on imports. A compromise pulled the nation back from the edge, but the wound never fully healed. The tariff had revealed a fault line running straight through the heart of the country. And that fault line would help lead eventually to war. Which brings us to the first time the income tax actually appeared, briefly, desperately, and out of sheer necessity. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the federal government faced a financial catastrophe on a scale it had never imagined. Fighting a war of that magnitude, feeding, arming, and paying vast armies, required staggering amounts of money. Far more than tariffs and land sales could possibly provide, especially with southern ports blockaded and trade in chaos. The government was desperate, and desperation breeds innovation. So for the first time in American history, Congress reached directly into the incomes of citizens and imposed a federal income tax to help fund the Union war effort. It was modest by our standards, and it was explicitly a wartime emergency measure. But it worked. It brought in real money at a moment of existential crisis. For the duration of the war and a few years after, Americans experienced something genuinely new, paying a tax on what they earned. And yet the old instincts remained. As soon as the crisis passed and the war debts were being managed, the pressure to get rid of it mounted. In 1872, the wartime income tax was repealed. The experiment was over. The country reverted to its familiar reliance on tariffs. And for a while, it seemed the income tax had been nothing more than a strange emergency footnote. But the world was changing, and that change would eventually make the old system impossible to sustain. The decades after the Civil War, the Gilded Age, transformed America almost beyond recognition. Railroads stitched the continent together, factories multiplied, cities swelled. Enormous industrial fortunes were built, creating a class of the fabulously wealthy, the likes of which the country had never seen, the tycoons of oil, steel, and railroads. And behind those glittering fortunes was a growing mass of workers and farmers who felt they were being crushed. Meanwhile, the tariff system kept humming along, and it produced a bizarre and telling problem. In some years, the high protective tariffs of the era brought in so much money that the federal government actually ran embarrassing surpluses. It was collecting more than it knew how to spend. And that surplus itself became a political scandal because critics pointed out something uncomfortable. This mountain of money was being extracted from ordinary consumers through inflated prices on everyday goods, while the great industrial fortunes at the top were being taxed almost nothing at all. This is the crux of the whole moral argument that was building. Think about how a tariff actually falls on people. A tariff raises the price of goods, clothing, tools, household items, the basic necessities of life. A poor family and a rich family buy many of the same basic goods, but that extra cost consumes a far larger share of the poor family's income. The tariff, in other words, was a regressive tax. It hit the working poor and the struggling farmer proportionally much harder than it hit the millionaire. A wealthy industrialist might pay the same few extra cents on a shirt as a factory worker, but for the worker that was real money, and for the tycoon, it was nothing. And so a powerful new idea began to spread across the country, especially among farmers in the South and West who felt they were being bled dry. The idea was simple and radical. Tax people based on their ability to pay. Instead of hiding taxes in the price of goods which hit the poor hardest, why not tax the enormous incomes of the wealthy directly? Why should the man earning a fortune contribute the same as the man barely scraping by? This was the birth of a fundamental shift in thinking, a move away from taxing consumption toward taxing income and wealth, away from the invisible tariff and toward something visible, deliberate, and aimed squarely at those most able to bear it. The pressure built through the populist movements of the late 19th century until, in 1894, Congress finally acted. As part of a tariff law, it included a provision for a modest income tax, a small percentage levied on incomes above a fairly high threshold, meaning it would touch only the wealthy. To its supporters, it was a matter of basic justice. The rich, who benefited most from the protections of American government and had prospered so enormously, should finally contribute a fair share. But the wealthy did not intend to accept this quietly, and they had a powerful weapon: the courts. The new income tax was almost immediately challenged, and the case rocketed up to the Supreme Court. It was called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, decided in 1895, and in one of the most consequential rulings of the era, the court struck the income tax down. By the narrowest possible margin, a 5-4 decision, the justices ruled that the income tax was unconstitutional. The legal reasoning turned on an old and technical corner of the Constitution. The founders, in their 18th century wisdom, had written rules about something called direct taxes, requiring that any direct tax be apportioned among the states according to their population, a requirement that made an income tax essentially impossible to administer fairly. The court decided that a tax on income derived from property was, in effect, one of these direct taxes, and since it hadn't been apportioned the impossible way the Constitution demanded, the whole thing had to fall. With that ruling, the dream of taxing the wealthy died, for the moment. The Gilded Age fortunes were safe, shielded by a century-old clause and a single swing vote on the Supreme Court. But you cannot kill an idea whose time has come. The Pollock decision didn't end the movement for an income tax. It enraged it, and it channeled it toward a much more powerful solution. If the Supreme Court said the Constitution forbade an income tax, then the answer was obvious, if daunting: change the Constitution. Amending the Constitution is deliberately, agonizingly difficult. It requires supermajorities in Congress and ratification by 3/4 of the states. It is meant to be nearly impossible. And yet the demand for a fairer tax system had grown so broad, so intense, spanning farmers and workers and reformers and progressives across regions and parties, that the impossible began to look inevitable. In 1909, Congress passed and sent to the states a proposed amendment, the 16th Amendment, which would explicitly give the federal government the power to tax incomes from whatever source without any of the apportionment nonsense that had killed the tax in Pollock. Then came the long wait as state after state debated and voted, and in 1913, nearly 140 years after independence, the 16th Amendment was ratified. The constitutional door that had been slammed shut was now thrown wide open. That same year, in the very same wave of reform, Congress passed a new law, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. And this law did two things at once, and together they marked the turning point of the entire story. It sharply lowered the tariffs that had funded the government for over a century. And in their place, it established a permanent federal income tax. At first, this new income tax was almost gentle, almost invisible. It was a low rate, and it applied only to the highest earners. Only a tiny sliver of the population, something like 3% of Americans, made enough to owe anything at all. In its very first year, it raised less than a tenth of federal revenue. If you had told an American in 1913 that this modest tax on the rich would one day become the central financial engine of the most powerful government in history, reaching into the paycheck of nearly every working person, they would have laughed in disbelief. The income tax entered the world quietly, almost apologetically, a small tax on the wealthy few. But we know what happened next. Wars came, a world war, then another, and each demanded money on a scale that dwarfed anything before. The government grew, took on new responsibilities, built new programs, expanded into corners of life the 19th century could never have imagined. And each time it needed more money, the income tax was there, ready to be expanded, the rates raised, the thresholds lowered, the reach extended down from the wealthy few to the broad middle. The trickle became a flood. The little tax on the rich became the foundation of the modern American state. So step back now and look at the whole sweep of it, because what you're really looking at is a story about how a society decides who should pay for the things it needs. For over a century, America chose to fund itself in a way that kept the tax invisible and kept the individual's earnings untouched, through duties on trade and the sale of a continent's worth of land. It was a system built by people who feared their own government, designed to raise money quietly so it would provoke as little resistance as possible. And for a small government in an expanding, trading nation, it worked in its way, but it carried hidden injustices. It fell hardest on those least able to pay, and it pitted region against region so violently that it helped drag the country towards civil war. And then, as America transformed into a modern industrial society with staggering inequality and a government that would need to do far more, the old system finally cracked. The shift to the income tax in 1913 was not just a change in accounting. It was a change in philosophy. It was a decision that the cost of government should be tied not to what you consume, but to what you earn. Not to how much you buy, but to how much you can afford to give. It was a move from an invisible tax that fell on everyone equally to a visible tax that asked the most from those who had the most. And here's why this history matters so much right now in our own moment. Because that fundamental argument, should we tax what people buy or tax what people earn? Should the tariff make a comeback as a way to fund the government? Or is that a return to a system that quietly punished the poor? That argument is not settled history. It has come roaring back into our politics in recent years, with serious proposals to lean once again on tariffs as a major source of national revenue, echoing the very system that existed before 1913. The debate that raged in the Gilded Age, the debate that split North from South, that sent a case to the Supreme Court and drove a constitutional amendment. That same debate is being fought again today, often by people who have no idea how old it is. So the next time you sit down in April with that stack of forms and feel that familiar dread, remember that the thing you're doing is not ancient. It's barely more than a century old. For most of American history, no one filed a return because the government paid its bills in a completely different way. A way full of clever workarounds, violent rebellions, regional warfare, and hard questions about fairness that we are still, right now, trying to answer. The income tax wasn't inevitable. It was a choice the country made after a long and bitter fight about the most basic question any society ever faces: who pays and how much and why? If this reshaped the way you think about taxes and where the money for a country actually comes from, take a second to hit that subscribe button. This channel digs into the hidden history behind the systems we take for granted. The money, the laws, the quiet decisions that shape the world we live in without most of us ever noticing. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think the country was better off funding itself through tariffs, or was the income tax the fairer path? Or I genuinely want to hear where you land on it. And if you got something out of this, it really does help these deeper stories reach more people. I'll see you in the next one.